Today we're going to hear from Alanah Mortlock and Lizzie Hobbs. They're going to be talking about their PhD projects for this panel, which has been titled New Directions in Gender Studies Research. And we're going to have a second part to this PhD panel probably in early-ish October, because we have a lot of students who have, a lot of doctoral students who are entering their third year or who are completing their third year. And I think what's been really fascinating about coming on board as the doctoral program director this month has been just to see how much the PhD projects are flourishing despite all of the challenges that everyone has had around COVID and working remotely and fieldwork being disrupted. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing both Lizzie and Alanah, and also hearing what everyone else has to say, and listening to Jacob's comments on the presentations today. So what we're going to do is have Alanah present first, and then Jacob's going to respond with a few thoughts and questions and have a bit of a discussion, and then we'll move to Lizzie, who will do the same in that order. And so if you could just save your questions for the chat after the presentation, after each of the presentations, or you can use the raise hand function, and I will hopefully see you all. And yeah, looking forward to this. Okay, I think I've said that 4 times, so it must be time to start. Alanah, I was just going to say very briefly that you've been working on your project for a couple of years with Sadie and SM, and you also work as a graduate teaching assistant. So those of you from the MSc program may have had you as a teacher for 424. Yeah, and yeah, so looking forward to hearing you. Oh my God, that's the 5th time I've said that. Okay, stopping.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Marsha. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, hopefully everyone can see the PowerPoint. Yes? Okay, great. So, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending our third year panel presentations. I'm really pleased to be here today to talk about my PhD research, Ambiguities in Black, a Black feminist analysis of the post-Dolezalian transracialism debates. So in this presentation, I want to give a general overview of the project, some information about why and how I'm doing it, talk through some of my findings so far, and then end with some reflections on what I think my project has to offer. I look forward to taking any questions you might have at the end. I have summarized the research questions that motivate my project in one main question, which asks, what do the post-Dolezalian transracialism debates do to the theorizing of Blackness? In my research, transracialism refers to the concept of a person changing racial identity. The term post-Dolezalian is significant because my research is interested in the discourse, concept, and figure of transracialism that emerged following the 2015 Rachel Dolezal scandal. While there had been some speculative academic writing engaging the concept of transracialism prior to this event, in my research, I argue that the Dolezal case marks a significant shift in the engagement, both qualitatively and quantitatively. In 2015, Rachel Dolezal, president of her local NAACP chapter and prominent local anti-racism campaigner, was outed as white by a local television news channel. She had been publicly representing herself as Black for several years, perhaps as long as a decade. Although this was ostensibly just a local scandal, within 24 hours, it was being reported by international news outlets and trending on Twitter under the hashtag transracial. This term, transracial, was initially used amongst conservative cultural commentators as a political provocation. Dolezal's outing happened just 10 days after Caitlyn Jenner's Vanity Fair cover, and the term was used to insinuate a hypocrisy in those who supported Jenner but decried Dolezal. It has been argued that it is because of this context that Dolezal's story received so much attention and why the discourse about transracialism gained such traction. It marked a new adjective on the battlefield of identity politics at a time when theories of fluidity in identity categories were gaining more mainstream attention. From the start, the discourse of transracialism was highly contentious. There were some who saw the concept as an exciting intellectual opportunity to explore and re-theorize the constitutive tensions in the micropolitics of gendered and racial identities. There were others, including many Black feminists, who found the concept and the discourse it spawned to be inherently problematic, with both anti-Black and transphobic logics. My project is less interested in Dolezal and her case themselves, and more so in the discourse that emerged around her and it. I argue in my work that the context of this case marks it as specifically about Blackness and Black identities, and I believe that, as these debates take up the concept of transracialism, they are actively engaging in the theorization of Blackness. In order to discuss what one might mean by transracialism, whether or not Dolezal's attachment to Blackness is legitimate, and whether the very concept of a transracial identity is anti-Black, it is necessarily true that there must be a conceptualization of Blackness, or an understanding of what it means to be Black and who might be described by the concept of Blackness. My project is fundamentally interested in uncovering what that conceptualization of Blackness is. Further to this, though, is an understanding of discourse as productive, which then means that the transracialism discourse does not only describe, but actively engages in the conceptualization of Blackness. Which is to say, I am interested in how the post-Dolezalian transracialism discourse makes claims and assertions about Blackness, what it is, who it is, and how it works. This happens intentionally, but also in the throwaway assumptions being made about Blackness and Black people. This transracialism discourse makes a particularly interesting site for thinking about the theorization of Blackness, as it also raises the question of how we settle anxieties raised by bodies that trouble racial boundaries. I contextualize my work in a history of scholarship that theorizes racial ambiguity as a highly policed border of Blackness, both socially and theoretically. By engaging with existing literature on mixed raceness and racial passing, I challenge the idea that Dolezal, her transracial claim, and the surrounding discourse are unprecedented in society or in theory. That is a pretty good description of my project as it is now, but I will admit that this is not the project I set out to write. The project I wanted to write was deeply concerned with Dolezal herself, with finding a way to delegitimize her claim to Blackness and to demonstrate a concrete difference between Rachel Dolezal and racially ambiguous and passing people. This was something of a passion project for me. These are some photos of me with my older sister, Natalie. I believe the first one is her first day of school, and as you can see, I'm very excited for her. And the second is her MSc graduation, and I'm still just really excited for her. We look quite different, so different, in fact, that throughout our lives, many people have found it difficult to believe that we're really sisters, and even harder to believe we have both the same parents. This is a euphemism, though, a polite way of disguising what is truly vexing them. The question lurking under the surface is always, if you're sisters, then why does one of you look Black and one of you look white? Except you're not really allowed to ask someone that. Being mixed race, Black Caribbean and white British, and racially ambiguous, these questions of racial ambiguity, being and belonging as they relate to Blackness have always been deeply personal to me. I have struggled to know whether the way I look precludes me from a meaningful attachment to Blackness, whether I might even call myself Black. I think that's why the Rachel Dolezal case made me so angry. Beyond angry, really, I was incandescent, inconsolable. To see Dolezal with such self-assurance claim an identity in which I had so long struggled to understand my place filled me with self-righteous anger. I believed I was different from her, but to be racially ambiguous like I am racially ambiguous is different than being what she is. And I believed a project exploring this difference could help theorize an authentic Blackness. And yet I did not write that project. Indeed, I could not write that project, and almost entirely because I read the work of Kai M. Green and Marquise Bay and Theodora Sakalarides. This work, grounded in a Black trans politics and epistemology, has called interlocutors in these transracialism debates not to fixate on an ontological project to authenticate or inauthenticate Dolezal's claim to a transracial identity. Such projects of identity authentication are theorized as not only futile, but even actively regressive, and a Black trans theoretical project that moves towards an understanding of both transness and Blackness as neither fixed nor knowable. Preferable is to engage with this transracialism by asking what it does and how it moves, what we might think of as its politics, and how we can interpret it as interacting with Blackness and the theorizing thereof. Confronted with this call, I came to realize that my revenge project was untenable. I still believe I'm different from her, but I am less persuaded by the political project of a concretely authenticable Black identity, especially considering the trans exclusionary implications of such projects. Which is not to say I have entirely let go of my anger, but I do not think that is inherently a hindrance to good research. To quote Sarah Ahmed, following anger into an interpretation of that which one is against is a mode of Black feminist intervention. And this has shaped my method of intervention as I have developed my project to instead apply a Black feminist lens to these discourses of transracialism and ask how they are using, inflecting, and changing understandings of Blackness and who might be called Black. I have described my methodology as an adjusted critical discourse analysis. As I have said, my project is interested in the ways the discourse of transracialism is affecting and inflecting the theorization of Blackness. Thus, it follows that I need a methodological tool that allows me to treat discourse as an analytical site, as not neutral, as not merely descriptive, but as actively engaged with processes of meaning making. For this reason, I identify discourse analysis as the most appropriate tool. The tradition of Foucauldian discourse analysis has much to offer my project, as it provides a flexible tool that reads discourse in a way that is attentive to the situations that provoke it and the consequences that it gives rise to. However, it is also important to remember that my project is fundamentally guided by a Black feminist commitment, and traditional Foucauldian discourse analysis has been criticized by feminist theorists for disregarding the role of the speaker. In doing so, it becomes insensitive to power imbalances that restrict who is more and less able to hold the position of the knower in academic knowledge production. For this reason, I have identified more strongly with traditions of critical discourse analysis, or CDA. Michelle Lazar has identified CDA as a particularly suitable tool for feminist projects for its critically useful view of discourse as a site of struggle, where forces of social reproduction and contestation are played out. I believe this makes CDA compatible with the aims of my project and further integrates a critical interest in the racial and heteronormative relations that oppress Black women and trans people. However, discourse analysis used in isolation would not be sufficient to achieve the objectives of my research. In my project, Blackness is conceptualized as not only discursively constructed. Building on the work of Black feminist theorists, I have understood affect and its circulation as also central to Blackness's construction. Thus, I have adjusted my CDA to be attentive also to the circulation of affect in the debates. This is particularly important given the presence of my own effective responses to the transracialism debates and wider questions about racial ambiguity. To turn these responses towards a method of analysis, I have used storytelling. In the thesis, this involves me telling stories about myself, my experiences, and my family, as I did earlier in this presentation when I introduced my sister to you. I am interested in how storytelling mobilizes anger as an analytical tool, but also how it revalorizes the position from which the knower speaks as the site of knowledge production. In a response to the transracialism debates, I believe this can be a path to revalorize the position of Black women. Further to this, the disruption that a narrative voice creates offers a new analytical and epistemological grammar in which emotion, feeling, and mood become structuring principles of articulation and understanding in feminist knowledge production. I chose to analyze both popular media and academic journal articles concerning Rachel Dolezal. I set my selection parameters for popular media articles as summer 2015 and summer 2017, dates made significant by Dolezal's outing and the release of her ghost-written autobiography, respectively. For journal articles, I considered those published after 2015 and collected data using keyword searches on Google and ProQuest. Through preliminary reading, I identified 4 sites at which I would conduct a more sustained and detailed analysis. The first is oculocentrism and ideas about the visuality of Blackness. The second is representations and narratives of transracialism in the context of mythologizing racial ambiguity. The third is the use of language and the figure of transness as a mode of articulating Blackness. And the fourth and last is the Black family as a site of constructing Black womanhood. So now I want to talk through some of my findings so far, and I'm quite excited about this part. This is taken from my chapter on representations, which I have understood as fundamentally an exploration of what kind of story the Dolezal incident is. In it, I ask how the transracialism discourse uses recognizable narratives to make sense of the events that took place, and then how the construction of Blackness is inflected by their narrative grammar. This chapter is motivated by a belief that stories matter, and particularly stories about Blackness. Representation is seen as a key site of racial production, and the analysis is contextualized by literature that argues the important role representing racial ambiguity has played in the construction of Blackness. In the analysis, I address 3 themes. Under lies and misrepresentations, I address how tropes of deception and untrustworthiness have become canonized in the transracialism debate in the context of the long and fraught history of constructing both Blackness and transness through such tropes. In sexy ambiguity, I deal with questions of desire, aspiration, lust, and racial ambiguity. The analysis of this section is held together by an interest in the sociocultural fetishization of primarily racial and ethnic ambiguity, although I also link this to the moral panic around gendered ambiguity. The theme I will be discussing in more detail today is tragedy. Here, I use histories of the tragic mulatto trope to consider how the post-Dolezalian figure of transracialism is a resurrection of this cautionary tale to those who trouble established racial boundaries. The tragic mulatto has been described by scholars of literature, media, and Blackness as one of the most recognizable and persistent characters in American and British media since the early 19th century. Most often a young woman, her narrative charts the tragedy of her racial inheritance being revealed and her fall as a consequence. The central conceit is that she could have been good and happy had her life not been blighted by the taint of Black blood. She is the prototypical figuration of the existential terror and anguish of racial ambiguity. Beyond this, though, her narrative is a phantasmic confrontation with this terror, which is ultimately reconciled by the tragedy of her story. An essential feature of the tragic mulatto trope is that she cannot outrun her destiny. In this way, she is perhaps best understood as a powerful existential fantasy of white racial comfort, a figure who fundamentally exists to stabilize and reify the tenuous boundaries between white and Black. The question then is, how does this relate to Rachel Dolezal? There have been times in my reading where I have found myself feeling almost sorry for Rachel Dolezal, dissonant as this feeling is. In my defense, I consider myself an empathetic person, and there are times when the life and circumstances of Rachel Dolezal make for fairly sorry reading. For example, what images does the extract on this slide conjure for you? Following a public shaming, the Dolezal of this article is shunned, mocked, rejected, and isolated. It sounds quite sad, really. Tragic, even. Interestingly, though, the author of this piece is feeling not at all sorry for her. Throughout the article, Milner writes with unveiled hostility towards Dolezal, who she comically refers to as a white lady with fussy hair and a bad tan trying to make fetch happen. This raises a moment of emotional and intellectual dissonance for me. How do we understand a representation of Dolezal that is simultaneously piteous and contemptible? The reading of Dolezal as a tragic character allows us to understand that she is piteous, perhaps not in the sense of sympathetic, but rather in the sense of wretched. More significantly, it provides a perspective from which Milner's hostility is not dissonant, but rather is in itself a mode of narrative instruction. The hostility that Milner's voice encourages readers to feel for the piteous character suggests that this representation of Dolezal might be best understood as a character in a moral tragedy. Dolezal is represented as fallen. Her piteous state is further proof that she is deserving of our contempt. Her fall serves as narrative justice and also a moral warning. This reading is made more persuasive by the realization that this representation does not seem to be entirely accurate of Dolezal's situation as of 2017. It is not my intention to suggest that she has not faced losses and hardships following her public shaming, which would be plainly false. However, reading between the lines of articles published at the same time, Dolezal also tells of how she is selling her art and books, has received invitations to give talks and speeches from respected bodies and media outlets internationally, and has a thriving hair business. She also regularly talks about the support she has received from friends, former colleagues, and strangers who relate to her story and appreciate her for various reasons. The narrative of Dolezal's fall as the total ruin experienced by the classic tragic mulatto is, I would argue, created by a selective attention to the facts, if not entirely constructed. Her story is fit into the mold because it is an easily digestible and cognitively pleasing narrative for readers to absorb. Dolezal becomes a story about troubling racial boundaries, and this requires the narrative closure of a tragic ending. Just as with the classic tragic mulatto, her narrative can be described as a moral tragedy in which the central figure is an ambiguous body who challenges the naturalized racial order. She enjoys the brief delights of recognition and acceptance in her fallacy, but her transgression is inevitably unearthed, leading to her swift and brutal reckoning. The story serves the same purpose it did in the time of the original tragic mulatto myth. It reaffirms the existing racial hegemony as the natural order. I hope this short example of the findings demonstrate the scope and implications of my research goes beyond the post-Dolezalian figure of transracialism. It is about contextualizing this figure in continuing histories of racial ambiguity as a site for the production and policing of Blackness and Black identities. This speaks to an essential Black feminist project to identify and challenge how theorizations of the human and its attendant narratives, including gender, have used Blackness and Black identities as malleable material for their own construction to the destruction of Blackness. In addition to this, my methodological intervention of storytelling moves to a Black feminist epistemology that foregrounds and revalorizes the body of the knower located in affective circulation as a site of knowledge production. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Alanah. I keep staring at that that screen, and I have to admit, I only noticed the not you in the last one. Yeah, thank you very much. And I'm going to let Jacob take the floor now.
Great. Thank you so much, Alanah, for that amazing presentation and for updating us about your work. I guess it's not a story, it's more of a memory of coming back on a bus from Cumberland Lodge. It must have been 2015 or 2016 when you were a master's student, when this had just happened. And I remember basically the entire ride back from Cumberland Lodge was a quite fierce, not ambiguous debate about Dolezal that you were having with other members of your cohort at the time. And no matter how long the sort of traffic stopped us getting into central London, there was quite an intense debate, and I could hear the startings of what then clearly became this project. And so it's really interesting to trace the history of that debate into the work that you're doing. I just have a few quick thoughts and a question, and then I figured it'd be really nice to just open it up for a broader discussion. But I wanted to just recognize a few things that I think are really exciting about the project as I'm hearing it and hearing you talk about it. And the first thing that really struck me was the shift in the question that's being asked in relationship to Dolezal, that it seems like so much of the debate and so much of the public conversation is like, what is? Right? Or who is Dolezal? And asking these questions that are then, of course, what is and who is Black? Right? What is Blackness? And I think that what is really exciting about the work work that you're doing is taking that question of what is and shifting it to a what does. What does it do to our conversation? What does it do to our conceptualizations of Blackness? And I think that there's something really useful and necessary about that shift in the question that takes us away from some of the sort of stuck forms of thinking that have been really problematic within the ways that Dolezal has been talked about, the way that race is talked about, particularly in the US, where this is this sort of where Dolezal is located, right? And so there's something really useful in the shift from that question. The second thing that I thought was really interesting, and it'd be nice to hear you say more about, perhaps, and other people have questions about it as well, is that there's, in the move from what you called the revenge project, right, to the project as it stands now. I think maybe for many people, their PhD projects or book projects start out as a revenge project. So it's an interesting sort of moment of recognition there. But in the move away from the revenge project, one of the things that you said was really instructive was reading Black trans feminist theory. I mean, you kind of just gestured to that through the work of people like Marquise Bay and others. And so I was wondering if you might want to say a little bit about what in particular that body of scholarship added to your research. Because of course, as you noted, Dolezal was used at that very moment to attack trans claims to authenticity and to livelihood. And the third one was just thinking about the importance of that storytelling work. I just thought that was a really nice way of bringing together this project. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what other kinds of stories you're putting in your project. And so then the question that I had might be a little obvious coming from me, but I was just thinking about the difference in language around ambivalence versus ambiguity. Because it sounds like part of what was animating the Revenge Project or animating some of the initial responses were quite antagonistic, perhaps understandably, responses to Dolezal that then you had to sort of grapple with. And so there could be a moment of thinking about how are you thinking through, is it an ambivalent response or an ambiguous one? It doesn't sound like it's that ambiguous, but there's something really powerful about ambiguity in your project where you're thinking about it as troubling yet maintaining racialized forms of seeing. You're talking about it as always being belied by an essential underlying truth, right? That is really, that comes out in the tragic mulatto trope, right? There's always some truth that underlies that person's quote unquote ambiguous status, but that truth is ascribed to that person as well as doing particular works in those narratives. So I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about the framing of ambiguity and what it does for your work. But really just to say congratulations, it's a really exciting project. And I think the work that you've presented today has been really fascinating. So I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, I really appreciate that. So yes, on the question of Black trans feminist theory, it really it's not an exaggeration to say that those two pieces that I referenced in the paper fundamentally changed the project, because reading those pieces, they are the first engagement with the debates that I'd come across that really hold them to account for the ways in which they reproduce social essentialist logics of race and gender in their project to try and articulate what it means to inhabit an authentic Black identity, how the discourses that we see are really reliant on rehearsing dialogues that have been happening in Black feminism and Black queer theory and Black trans theory for many decades, and how at the moment that this new perceived threat emerges, how the first people, the first bodies, the first identities that are sacrificed are those more vulnerable bodies of Black trans people, who are made particularly vulnerable by the discourse of the transracialism debate for how it attempts to appropriate both transness and Blackness. So the first thing was really this this political impetus to who are your commitments to, I think is how I would frame it. The second way that then further reading of Black trans theory has really influenced my work has been through I've been reading a lot of I suppose I'd call it anti-ontology, Black trans feminist work that really deals with the matter of both Blackness and transness, and the idea that they are what's kind of commonly referred to as the outside of ontology, and the idea that they kind of present the opportunity of this rupture, this eruption into ontology, which is understood in kind of the European post-enlightenment sense of the rational, red, white, cis, heteronormative, male, human figure. And so this understanding of Blackness and transness as not properties of bodies, but rather as kind of the excess, that which is incapable, that which the narratives of white supremacy and heteropatriarchy are incapable of holding and describing, but at the same time are fundamentally imbricated with, because by being the outside of that figure of the rational human, they are both its condition and also that which has the power to destabilize it, which I think has affected my project in that as I've moved away from this kind of revenge project of authenticating or inauthenticating, it's led to me thinking much more about how the discourse on transracialism kind of plays into that post-enlightenment project of the human, rather than dealing with how that project is always fundamentally foundationed on Black and trans exclusion. The importance of storytelling, so again, thinking back about my revenge project, something I was having real difficulty articulating when I first applied for the PhD and was working on this project was it was always a lot about my identity, even when it was a lot about how much rage I have for Rachel Dolezal. It was always a lot about what does this say about me and people like me, which might be terribly self-centered, but there it is. And one of the chapters I was considering having in that thesis was a kind of an autoethnography, where I kind of took some space to process events in my life that kind of drew the liminality of racial ambiguity into kind of clearer perspective. And I had a really productive conversation with my wonderful supervisor, Sadie, about it, where while the project was kind of in this process of developing, where Sadie essentially said to me that it didn't seem to be answering the same question that the rest of my project was answering. So as the project developed and changed from dealing with those initial questions about, well, what's the difference between transracialism and racial ambiguity, I was still left with all of these feelings and effective responses that whenever I was writing were just there, were just waiting to express. And as I thought more seriously about affect as method, and really kind of taking seriously this epistemological commitment that I claim, that I take affect seriously as a site of knowledge and as a site of identity production. Realize, and also the kind of the political and epistemological commitment that I claim to reflexivity, I realized that it's just untenable to try and write this thesis without thinking about the effective responses that I'm having as I'm writing. And I think storytelling, it's such a feature of so much of the feminist and Black feminist literature that I love. When I think about writers like Audre Lorde and Sarah Ahmed and our own lovely Claire Hemmings, and the kind of scholar I want to be, it just felt like a very natural way of developing that. Ambivalence versus ambiguity. I also realize I've been talking for a really long time.
You could respond to those, or you could hold those, because maybe we will have some time at the end. But
okay.
I just thought that it might be a good idea, if there isn't anyone, then you could go back to that those questions. But I just wondered if there was anyone from the Zoom audience that would like to make a comment or pose a question or engage with Alanah's wonderful presentation, which gave so much for us to think about. I can't see if there's hands. Claire?
Hang on. There now. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you so much for such a fantastic presentation, Alanah. It's lovely, as Jacob said, to hear how your project's developed over time. And I'm really so impressed by the ways in which you've moved the question of affect from one that kind of secures ontology or identity in the ways you've described, towards thinking about affect as one of the techniques through which transracialism is enabled to do the work you're interrogating, and thinking about it as in terms of its effects. So that just sounds fantastic, because there was a danger, wasn't there, at some point, that you might abandon the affective work, or try and sort of, take loss or rage out of the picture in ways that would also have been, made it less rich, I think. I wondered, when you were talking and when you showed us the images of your sister and you, one of the things that it made me think about was, is there another arena, and maybe it's for a postdoc, I don't know, but which is about reading practice. So, because you might have identity on the one hand, or ontology, and you might want to challenge that by instead looking at the ambiguities of that and so on. But it struck me that in a sense, your bringing of us into your project relies on us reading the picture of your sister and you in a straightforward way, right? Or in a way that assumes that we'll read you in a particular way and your sister in a particular way. And that made me think, I mean, and that's true, right? That's one of the ways in which people come into being as social rather than as interior, ontologically determined subjects is through the ways in which reading happens, right? And that's certainly true, of course, also of trans subjects, and the difference between cis and trans, which is, of course, also unstable in terms of how it's read and when people think it's present and when they think it isn't. And so I just wondered about that question of reading practice and whether you address that or whether that's just for another time, but it just struck me that,
It's not something I'm addressing in the project at the moment. It is something I've certainly thought about, because I think this project has forced me to reflect on my own reading practices, particularly as regards racial ambiguity. I have actually quite a lot of mixed race friends, and we tend to think that we can recognize other mixed race people and something that we and it's something that the idea being that you build up a lexicon, I guess, to continue the language of reading practices of what you may be looking for. And in my chapter on ocular centrism, I to somewhat engage with it, and I discuss my own feelings about when Black, usually Caribbean people have kind of read me as mixed race or read me as Caribbean, and what my own relationship with that kind of identification is. What I haven't reflected on is in what situations and in what kinds of social relations I tend to have been read in what sorts of ways. And I think that, as you say, could make a really interesting project for thinking about reading practices. And something else I think that could be really interesting is thinking about, there's a really fascinating article by C. Riley Snorton about the politics of passing, I guess, as in terms of gendered ambiguity, and what it means to take up, I believe it's Stryker's call to kind of reject the demand that that people pass, and to actively participate in the disruption of those kinds of reading practices, which is a fairly disorganized way of saying it's not something that I'm thinking about at the moment, but it is something that I think would be really interesting.
Thanks so much, Alanah. And I'm so sorry that we have to sort of cut this discussion short, and I hope we'll be able to return to it formally at the end of this session or informally afterwards. But yeah, and I'd love to at some point ask you questions about some of these very similar debates that have been going on amongst Indigenous communities in Canada, who I think use actually storytelling as one of the ways of authenticating to some extent belonging and membership to communities. So it would be really interesting to have a discussion with you about that.
Research, your engagement, your theorization, and the problem itself is something that was sparked by it, but definitely goes beyond the event itself and what has happened. So to what extent is what has happened with Rachel Dolezal crucial to what you are talking about, and how important it is to have her, given that sort of difficult relationship to what has happened in the title, to draw attention to the issues that you are talking about?
Thank you for the question. So as Sadie can attest, it has taken me a very long time to provide a working title for the thesis. I've been unwilling to give it a title for the last 3 years. It's definitely something I've struggled with, and I think part of the reason it took me so long to come to a title is that if you can hear crackling, that's my cat scratching in the background. It's not the line. I think part of the reason it took me so long to come to a title was that I understood how important the title is in setting the tone for how I want the rest of the thesis to be read. And it was important to me that I find a way to express through the title that for me, it's not a project about transracialism. It's a project about Blackness and about negotiating the anxieties, but also the lived realities of racial ambiguity. But that it is inseparable from Rachel Dolezal, or I would slightly adjust that to say it's inseparable from these debates that have Rachel Dolezal's case at the heart of them. Because that was if we trace the genealogy of the project, I guess that's kind of the starting point, but also because she's the primary case study. There have been other cases since Dolezal. The one that comes to mind, I've forgotten her name, Jessica, I've forgotten her name, but another American academic who was outed in 2020. And I chose not to engage with work written about her. Although something that was really interesting is the extent to which work written about, or I say work responses written about her, hark back to Dolezal and kind of compare her to, or even brand her as kind of the new Rachel Dolezal. So I think in the part of the title that comes before the colon, I really wanted to establish this as how I see the project. But in order to give what felt like an accurate description of what the project is actually doing, it looks to make interventions into the theorization of Blackness and racial ambiguity, but it does do that at the site of the post-Dolezalian transracialism debates. So there is an ambivalence, to bring it back to ambivalence there, to how I reckon with that, but reckoning with that painful relationship I have with Dolezal is also something that I have to do in the thesis.
Thanks, Alanah. Thank you for taking up that question in the last 5 minutes. We're pretending we're at the end. No, I think we should, in fairness, we wouldn't have been able to, I guess, potentially overwhelm you with a whole series of questions, because we would have been sharing the session with Lizzie, and I'm so sorry, Lizzie, that this happened to you today. But I think I just want to thank Alanah and Jacob and Lizzie for for participating and for agreeing to do today, to participate in this panel. And we will get on to rescheduling Lizzie's session really soon.